do we not run the risk that bodies might, do we not run the risk that bodies might end up feeling contented, you know, satisfied by what we have? Imagine if we were to fight austerity and so on. Do we not run the political risk of running into a plateau where bodies feel satisfied enough?
It was clear for you, Judith. It was clear for you.
Kind of.
Okay. And please, finally, João, and then, if you want to, okay, Judith. Please, 4 or 5.
In relation to the idea of the network that built the bodies, and in relation to the risk of the segmentations of the alternatives in order, you know, for the market, I don't know, like targets, or is it this network? Could we say that it's something we could we universalize this network in some ways? Is this the task?
Can I have another one and finish this first? Okay. So please, João asked it first. Okay. Sorry. And then we stop. And João is here. Yes. With it. Yes, with the blue shirt.
Well, thank you so much for your conference. It's
Well,
fundamental for us in gender studies to have you here, and we are very happy to have you here. I would just like to ask you if you have any thoughts about the ideas around necropolitics and the relationship of necropolitics with the type of austerity measures we are suffering in Southern Europe and in other places. Thank you.
So, okay.
Okay, so let's try to take this.
Yeah.
Let's try to take this on.
Thank you, Judith Butler.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me. I don't know if this is supposed to be up like this.
If you want to use mine.
No, it's okay. It's all right. Well, let me talk a little bit about radical democracy. My colleague, my friend Ernesto Laclau, of course, died this last year, and I was just at a conference in Paris where many people were trying to think through the meaning and future of radical democracy in the wake of his death. And although I had some interesting and wonderful disagreements with him, I think I do agree with him that radical democracy requires that we think about fundamental democratic principles such as equality and justice and freedom as open-ended concepts that are that have been established, and they must remain open-ended precisely because they have been established on false grounds, that is to say, on grounds that are exclusionary. Equality for whom? Freedom for whom? The Constitution of my country asserted certain liberal political principles for white men who owned property and claimed that they were that all the rights in the Constitution were universal, right? So we can see how the problem of universality has been implicated in radical exclusion and anti-democratic structural investments. So radical democracy, it seems to me, has to be willing to question the framework within which we accept settled ideas of what equality, justice, and freedom may be. So when people started claiming that they were mobilizing for gender freedom, There were others who said, well, that's not really a domain of freedom. Even Hannah Arendt would say that's not a domain of freedom. Right? Gender is a fact, it's given. Gender is a historical situation that is, or a biological situation, or something that's given. It's not made, it's not an exercise of freedom. But so when people came forth to say, no, this is an exercise of freedom, that meant we had to rethink our concept of freedom. Our concept of freedom had excluded the possibility of conceptualizing gender freedom. Now, you could come back and say, well, that's too much, or that's the wrong kind of freedom, or I don't agree with everyone who lays claim to freedom in that way. And then we have a dispute. We have a hegemonic debate about, you know, which view is better, which view is right, which view ought to hold. I sat next to a French politician once, kind of against my will, and he said to me that, well, gay, lesbian, parenting, that's okay. I don't see why they can't be parents just because they're gay or lesbian. But he didn't think that prostitution should be understood as choice. And he didn't think that surrogate motherhood should be accepted because that puts that puts the womb into market relations, right? So he was willing, and I'm not going to take a big stand on these things, although I am in favor of the enfranchisement of sex workers, and I do think they choose under the conditions that they choose. Okay, but here's the thing. I do think that that when these kinds of issues emerge, right, it's not just, okay, shall we extend our given idea of freedom to this new claim, this new movement, this new mobilization, and if we do extend it, whoever we are, do we have to rethink what we mean by freedom? In other words, has our idea of freedom excluded, by definition, certain populations that are coming back and actually demanding a rearticulation of the concept? So I am, in general, in favor of a notion of radical democracy that also would involve the radical reorganization of the economy, and would prioritize social democratic rights and obligations in a way over and against privatization and the decimation of such possibilities under neoliberal regimes. Similarly, if I can just move to the necropolitics question, I think that Achille Mbembe is clearly right to have us supplement our idea of Foucault's concept of biopolitics with an idea of necropolitics. Because for Foucault, of course, biopolitics focused on the management of populations, and he was more interested in how populations were divided up and how they were contained, or how their interests were separated from one another, or how bureaucratic control or administrative power operates to discipline subjects in certain kinds of ways. Of course, Foucault did talk about those biopolitical policies that let people die, right? It was a very important formation that let people die. So they didn't actively kill them, but they let them die. And I believe that what Mbembe has done is actually taken this moment of Foucault and read it through, say, Fanon, read it through post-colonial theory, in order to think about how the management of populations is also about preparing certain populations to die, or letting certain populations die en masse. So we see that, for instance, in the treatment of disease, but we see it, of course, most flagrantly in the boatloads of hopeful immigrants who are left to die in the Mediterranean. Odd that the European governments and the EU would let that happen, given that there's all that expensive property along the coast. No, where are those bodies going to wash up, right? Like right in the middle of the most expensive resorts. Okay, sorry, that's just my little fantasy, I guess. But, you know, I mean, I think we can see more and more, especially in the margins of the metropole and on the borders of almost every European country at this point, populations that are amassed that have no citizenship, that have no future, that are not being allowed to go one way or another and are not being provided for. I think more broadly, this is an example of the necropolitical extension of Foucault's theory. I think austerity measures, I mean, I think we have to think about austerity measures as producing populations with unpayable debt, producing populations who can no longer live in their own homes. I mean, there's a kind of slow and steady expulsion into indebted homelessness. And I think that happens both in the peripheries of Europe, for sure, and it also happens on the borders. We also see, I mean, we could track this, I think, globally in many complex ways that I'm not able to do right here tonight. I don't know whether I would universalize the idea of the network, although there are network theorists who would do that, and that's an interesting way to go. I do think the network as a concept allows us to think about bodily assemblies, but also virtual networks and solidarities that cross virtual and embodied space. I think it's an important concept. I'm not sure I would universalize it.